If you've followed this channel for any length of time, you know that I consider American politicians to be a terrible blend of ignorance and narcissism. But sometimes the level of cluelessness and ignorance of these politicians shocks even me. And today, it's Donald Trump who's putting his foot in his mouth, and his vice president, J.D. Vance. We're going to talk about just what their hot takes on Ukraine are and why they are just so unbelievably stupid. I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's get into it. Okay, so this is the actual quote from Trump at a rally in Georgia yesterday. He says, quote, Biden says, we will not leave until we win. Trump's impersonating Biden. And then he continues, what happens if they win? He means Russia. What happens if they win? That's what they do, is they fight wars. As somebody told me the other day, they beat Hitler, they beat Napoleon. That's what they do. They fight, and it's not pleasant. Now, there's a whole bunch wrong with this statement, right? And one, I want to point out that it should trouble you, as it should trouble anybody, if a presidential candidate, someone who not only is running for president, but already ran the country, doesn't know that the Soviets fought Hitler until the other day. The man's 78, guys. One, either he forgot, he knew it and forgot about it, which would be sort of a troubling sign of cognitive impairment, or he literally didn't know, right? I give you credit. Napoleonic Wars were in the 1880s. But guys, if you don't know that Germany and the Soviet Union fought each other in the Second World War, then how do you know? Why do you think the Cold War happened? And if you don't know why the Cold War happened, how do you understand modern politics? How do you even understand Putin's thinking, right? If you can't put that in context. Remember, Putin's somebody who gave a history lesson on the 1,000-year Russian history, unprompted, actually, in his interview with Tucker Carlson, just went off on it. And Trump is like, wow, I just heard a crazy fact the other day. World War II happened. Now, here's the other thing. He's not necessarily wrong that Russia has two big wins in the last, 250 years? No doubt about it. In the last 250 years, they beat some heavyweights. But they also have a comparable number of terrible losses. We're going to talk about that. But first, let's talk about J.D. Vance, who's actually generally the more sane person, or at least the more articulate person in this duo. And J.D. Vance rolled out his peace plan on the Sean Ryan show, which, Sean Ryan, it's the podcast for Milbros, or it's the Joe Rogan show for Milbros. And I actually kind of like Sean Ryan. I think he's a more thoughtful guy than Joe Rogan. And again, credit to him for bringing J.D. Vance on and getting him to talk and actually put a real action plan out there. I give credit to, at this point, any U.S. politician who details an actual policy position. That said, this one, it sounds like the Trump-Vance administration's policy might just be let Putin win. Why? Because it involves the contours of it involve a negotiated settlement that they essentially freeze the current battle lines between Russia and Ukraine and heavily fortify them into a demilitarized zone to prevent further Russian aggression. In this scenario, where Ukraine would retain its independence, but adopt a neutral stance, refraining from joining NATO and other allied institutions. So there's a bunch of problems with this. This doesn't even sound good at the face. One, because it would require Russia to sign away a portion of its sovereign territory in Kursk. So while Ukraine would lose more, Russia would also lose a significant portion of Kursk. Second, there was already a heavily fortified demilitarized zone as part of the earlier annexation of Crimea and the Donbas, right? That was another Russian-backed separatist movement that essentially also had battle lines frozen and essentially functioned as a demilitarized zone. But the answer is the Russian-backed separatists literally never respected it. They only treated the ceasefires long enough to rearm. And the problem is that Russia has invaded Ukraine and seized its sovereign territory in 2014 and then again in 2022. And so, but don't worry, guys, this third demilitarized zone will work. The only reason it could possibly work is if Ukraine joined NATO. That would be the other side, right? That in theory could work if Ukraine had a trump card that said, listen, we have a real deterrent against Russia now because we're NATO members. But his scenario also gives Putin the other thing he wants, which is that Ukraine won't join NATO, which means, think about your Ukraine. You have no leverage because you're going to lose to Russia because you're not a NATO ally. And again, remember, Putin knows that the West, Putin believes that the West just wants out. It's like the Taliban, right? You notice when the Taliban first took over Afghanistan, they said, no. We don't want the U.S. to have to intervene again. We're going to totally respect women's rights. We're totally not going to commit a bunch of human rights violations against the previous government. We're totally going to be respectful. Within 90 days, they were banning girls from schools. They were just doing mass executions of former government officials. It was an absolute total shit show. And you know why they could do that? Because they knew the U.S. had already left and wasn't going to re-intervene. So Putin's going to say, listen, Putin says, listen, we can totally intervene in Ukraine in any way we want because NATO literally was the ones who backed away from this. And NATO said, we're not going to touch them. So Putin is not going to interpret this. Putin literally will understand this to mean Ukraine is yours to influence because NATO isn't going to try to exert influence on it, right? Look at other neutral countries. For example, Georgia, right? Or Moldova. These are non-NATO Baltic countries. In fact, almost every one of these non-NATO Baltic countries has had either their government seized by pro-Russian entities that aren't letting it go, or Russia has an active campaign to subvert their government. Moldova is a classic example. Right now, the Russian government is spending massive amounts of money to try to get pro-Russian parties into power in Moldova. They're actually preparing to stage riots. They're literally prepping the information space in the event that these pro-Russian candidates lose. And so for Ukraine, who's not going to have allies, again, NATO said, we're not here to help you. And we'll never help you. Russia's going to take it to say you can mess with them as much as you want. And the thing is, they have already, right? Lukashenko was a corrupt pro-Russian president who stayed in power only through authoritarian rule and election fraud. So this is completely preposterous and ignores the reality. And this is the thing, guys. A treaty is only worth the paper it's printed on, right? Just like you can get a fraudster to sign 100 contracts, but it won't change the fact that they're a fraudster, right? And so this sort of peace deal which will give Ukraine no leverage in the event of a violation, right? Again, you could do this if you told me that U.S. troops were going to man the demilitarized zone. But again, functionally, that gives Ukraine all the benefits of NATO without any of the contributions. Because again, it would mean that U.S. troops, an attack on Ukraine would be an attack on U.S. troops. So this is just preposterous, right? And I'm not saying that Ukraine, the peace deal won't involve some level of secession of giving, Ukraine ceding territory to Russia and its 6 million citizens behind Russian lines. But again, Ukraine is going to not buy a neutrality agreement because remember, in the 90s, Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons in exchange for a treaty that said, we won't violate your sovereignty. And when it happened in Crimea, you know what the West did? Nothing. It wasn't until Putin literally rolled tanks into Ukraine that suddenly the West went, oh yeah, we did sign that treaty that said that we would all respect your neutrality. So a neutrality agreement is worth nothing to the Ukrainians, right? And again, it would require, pledging not to join NATO, would also require completely subverting NATO policy in its entirety. For 70 years, the NATO rule has been the door is open to any state. And then we'd have to shift it and say, actually, the Russians were too strong, guys. They beat us. Now we're going to have a carve out that says any state but Ukraine. well, actually, and Russia's going to say, well, now we have a playbook and I've got this huge military. So why don't I just do it with every Baltic state? Just annex a third of their territory, fight as long as necessary. The West is already depleted of all their willingness to support. They're politically depleted. They're, militarily depleted. Why not just do it with every Baltic state and say, I need neutrality in all these other states too. I need neutrality in Belarus. I need neutrality in, Latvia. Anywhere Putin has designs, right? He's going to sit there and roll in and then demand the West pledge neutrality, which is not neutrality. Again, he's going to intervene and prop up his governments. You have to negotiate with the person in front of you, not with your ideals. And this is, but here's the thing. The only person who believes these things are meaningful, who believes that this is a real potential peace plan and not total capitulation by the Ukrainians, is Putin himself. So here's an example of Putin's peace proposal. Sounds a lot like J.D. Vance's. Okay, so this is from mid-June of this year. Putin proposed on Friday to immediately order a ceasefire in Ukraine and begin negotiations if Kiev withdrew troops from the 4 regions annexed by Moscow, essentially, again, freezing the battle lines where they are, because those 4 regions are about 80% occupied by Russia, and if Ukraine renounced its plans to join NATO, right? So this is, again, the fact that Putin's proposal and J.D. Vance's proposal and Trump's proposal are all in alignment should tell you exactly where their interests lie. Now, before I talk about why Trump particularly, his little example of how Russia always wins these wars, we're going to talk about the fact that if you feel a little bit like you're the underdog against what feels like a Napoleon level threat, right? You don't have to be like Russia and kill millions of your people to get that win. Instead, you may just need more caffeine. Check out some Strike Gum. If you're an energy drink user and you're tired of spending $5 a pop for a can of carbonated chemicals that taste like cough medicine, you want some Strike Gum. 90 milligrams of caffeine in each piece, 100 milligrams of alpha GPC. This is natural caffeine, right? The only artificial stuff in here is really going to be xylitol. This is so much better for you. 0 sugar. And best of all, on strikegum.com right now, we have free shipping with all subscriptions. So if you know you're already a Strike Gum fan, right, and you've kicked caffeinated energy drinks to the curb, then you want to get on board with this, right? Get the free shipping, guys. All orders over $40. So order your 2 5-packs and get going. Check us out on Amazon or on strikegum.com. The link is in the description. Okay, here's the other conversation that we need to have. Like, it is true that Russia or the Soviet Union, or before that, the Russian Empire, have indeed beaten World War II Germany and Napoleon. There's a couple of just minor details here. The first is that those wars were fought on Russian territory, which is crucial for 2 reasons. One, Russia has no choice but to win. Okay? You win or you don't have a country. And that is a powerful motivator, right? 2, Russia winter. The Russian winter remains undefeated, guys. But guess what? The war in Ukraine is not fought in Russia. Ukraine is way south of Russia. Nobody's going to be dealing with that Russian winter, okay? But 3, and 3 is most important, is that every time Russia's been defeated, it's been by a Ukraine type of event. Here is a list of all the Russian wars. And I point one other note out, is that the Soviet Union has significantly more territory and resources when they fought the Germans, and the Russian Empire that fought Napoleon also controlled massively larger and more resources. In fact, the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union encompassed Ukraine. That's the whole point of the Ruski Mir. So to sit there and be like, wow, a more powerful country managed to beat other powerful countries in the last 250 years. It happens sometimes. Now let's take a look at more recent wars. You can see that Russia, the current geopolitical entity. Well, actually, let's talk about the fall first. This is important. The last war of the Soviet Union ended in 1989, was the Soviet-Afghan War. And it was a defeat. The Afghans beat them. Now, don't get me wrong, the Afghans beat the United States too. But this is the takeaway, guys. They didn't, you can say, oh yeah, they beat Napoleon, but they lost to the Afghans. Why? Because the Soviets weren't defending their home turf. So it was a cost-benefit analysis, and the Afghans were just unrelenting. And their secret sauce was that they had some support from the United States. All right, a larger power supporting them. Even though they were a much smaller entity, they still managed to just simply grind on the Soviets until the war of choice, not war of survival, until the Soviets said, we got to get out of here. And in fact, that was such a humiliating defeat that it collapsed their entire government. There was literally not a Soviet Union. And remember, like a dozen Soviet republics became independent countries. Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Georgia, Ukraine, all became independent countries. Right? So the much larger, much more powerful Soviet Union lost to the Afghans. And again, the United States, we lost to them too. Credit where credit's due. They know how to fight. But guess what, guys? That means that you should use their playbook. Who else has Russia lost to? Oh, look, they lost to the Chechens, guys. The Chechens. All right? This is not even a country. This is a tiny, tiny state within their country. And they took an L. Right? The Chechens got de facto independence, but was only du jour part of the Russian Federation. Again, don't get me wrong, the Russians went back and they won, but they won against the Chechens 3 years later. But only because they sandblasted Grozny into the dirt. And they won the Russo-Georgia War, right? A couple-day war. But here's what I want to point some things out. Again, these guys have lost to the Chechens. They've lost to the Afghans. You know who else they lost to? Literally at the same time, or right after they totally beat Hitler, the winter beat Hitler, they got beat by the Finnish. The Soviets invaded Finland and they wanted to conquer all of Finland, but they failed. How did Finland beat them? They beat them the exact way, the exact playbook that the Ukrainians are now using against the Russians. So to sit there and say Russia always wins. Russia doesn't always win. Yeah, there's a bunch of these minor incidents, right? They were victorious in the Tajikistan Civil War, or the Transnistrian War, the War for Abkhazia, right? South Ossetian War, Georgian Civil War. Sure. But you look at the United States too. You guys could see we have also a bunch of officially listed victories here in minor interventions, right? Our intervention in Libya defeated ISIS, victory, right? We defeated ISIS in Iraq. We defeated the Lord's Resistance Army in Uganda, and we're victorious in the Libyan Civil War, sort of. So you've got every country has a bunch of minor victories that, where they obviously, every country tries to be involved in wars where they have the greatest chance of winning and a minimized chance of losing. But when it really counted, when the wars start to stretch a long time like this, guess what? The Russian track record is honestly pretty terrible. Again, especially when it's outside of their home turf. Anyway, guys, that's all I had. Huge thank you to the Colonel tier members of CombatVetNews.com like James Sterling, Steve Moran, Doug Beck, Alan Knudsen, Bastian Hemmerling, Brian Kelly, Dale McCombs, James Ola, and Henry Roussier, as well as all of our Lieutenant tier members. I couldn't do this without you guys. I appreciate you so much, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Cheers.